Today, we answer the age-old question of man versus horse. In particular, I'll be reviewing two movies in this video, 200% the films I normally review in one video. The first one is The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, a movie from 1956, and the second one is The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit, this movie right here, which is from 1968. I'll be comparing one of these and touching on some of the enormous contrasts between the two, which include a telling gulf in quality. Let's start with the first movie, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Like I said, this is from 1956. It was directed by Nunnally Johnson. It's got Gregory Peck, Jennifer Jones, Frederick March in it, and also Lee J. Cobb in a slightly smaller role playing a judge, I think. This movie I've seen a couple months ago, so hopefully I can remember what happens, whereas this movie I watched just a couple of days ago and is still sharp up here, although that's not exactly ideal. So first of all, with The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, what's the vibe of this movie? Well, it's based on a book, and that really shows. So it's novelesque and very broad. One of the main criticisms I've seen of this movie, if you look at some of the reviews on IMDb, for instance, a lot of people say it's too long or it's poorly edited. Now, why do movies end up being too long? Sometimes it's because they're overindulgent. The directors have a blank check and are making some auteur sort of thing, and they get carried away and make something that nobody really cares about. That definitely happens. There are also plenty of movies that are accused of that happening, where people just, I think, don't really get it. But in the 50s, a lot of these movies are pretty tightly controlled by the studio. It's not very likely that a movie is going to accidentally be way too long. And so there are reasons why movies are longer, and oftentimes when people are complaining about a movie being poorly edited, I think they might be missing the scope in some ways. So in this movie, what that boils down to basically is that although the movie kind of centers around Gregory Peck and his family, what this movie is really about is a much broader question of a certain type of corporate Connecticut/Westchester America and its relationship to World War II. And you see that in a lot of different ways. I'll talk about it a bit more. I mentioned it just now. This movie is sort of a war movie, but it's one that takes place after the fact. So you see some flashbacks to World War II, where Gregory Peck was sort of a hero. But this is, like I said, the war is kind of in the past tense. And life has continued, but life is continuing on somewhat shaky ground. And this is kind of a study of that in general. In a lot of ways, this is a spiritual successor to the amazing movie, The Best Years of Our Lives, from, I think, 1946. And a big hint about that is that that movie also stars Frederick March in a phenomenal role there. Well, he's back. And like I said, if you just think about this movie as being a little story about Gregory Peck's workplace conundrums, dramas, or something like that, well, there would be no reason for Frederick March to even really be in the movie or be a major character. You wouldn't meet his wife and his kids. And so, you know, like I said, if you don't grasp onto that, you might feel like, what the heck is this doing in here? Why is this way too long? There's all these plot lines that don't go anywhere. Well, in fact, the scope of this movie is broad. It's based on a book. It's novelesque. Okay, I think we get the idea. A big theme of this movie is moral life. Gregory Peck, when he's in the movie, you should be thinking, a big theme of this movie might be moral life. Now, that's not always the case. And in fact, in 1956, Gregory Peck would not yet have starred in To Kill a Mockingbird, which was the movie that really cemented him as morality guy. He's the good guy. He's the upstanding citizen. And in some of his early movies, it's a slightly different role. That said, even in 1956, people, I think, almost certainly would have still associated with him as being sort of this moral guy. And that's more or less what he is here, although they push on that and pull at that a fair amount. But as an earnest American, blue-blooded, he was, of course, a war hero. This isn't really talked about very much, and a war hero probably isn't right, but in some ways, he had a successful military career. Let's put it that way. And he's recognized in some ways by his peers as such. But now he's back from the war, and he lives out in Connecticut. He takes the train, the Metro North. I used to take the Metro North before the pandemic. And he meets a bunch of people there. He gets recruited for other jobs there. But Gregory Peck, being the moral, upstanding guy, doesn't work for a big corporation. He works for an organization. I can't recall if you ever learn what this organization does or if it's just referred to as the organization, but it's implied that he's working for some sort of good guys, but of course he doesn't get paid very much. And here is where you get some of the first scent of conflict. His wife wants more. They're enmeshed in this Connecticut lifestyle, New York corporate world, and they live out in the suburbs. They want a bigger house, they want a better car, and things like that. So that's sort of the first scent of conflict, is the sort of contradiction between moral life and big business, all sort of with the backdrop of the war. Perhaps the war makes you set in your priorities. Perhaps the war makes you consider the difference between morals and money and which ones really matter. That's sort of a question in the movie. Big business, how's it portrayed? Well, not that great. Gregory Peck eventually agrees. This isn't really a spoiler. I shouldn't say eventually. It's in the beginning of the movie, but he agrees to dip a toe in the water at a bigger company and just see what it's about and go for an interview there. And at the interview, they ask him a question along the lines of, take some time to write down why you're interested in working for this company. And what an interesting question. These days I think we're all pretty used to interviews as a very specific format of interaction, a very cultivated, programmatic means of communicating, where you basically BS everything. Why are you interested in working for a company? Well, you probably aren't, but they'll give you money, and then you can do things like that. Now, do you actually want money? Well, who knows, but they'll give you money, and that will make you feel good inside for various complex cultural and social reasons. So this question of why you're interested in a job is hard, and although most of the time we're happy to answer, to tell people what they want to hear, Gregory Peck, both being this moral character, but also in bearing some of the scars from the war, has trouble answering that question, which is telling, and really sets the stage for some of the struggles he'll have of his interests and his values being continuously challenged and being continuously at odds with sort of the accepted way of living in the mainstream and finding success. For me, and I think for a lot of people my age, my peers from school, this is pretty relatable. The question of, will you go, sell your soul to a big company? Now, of course, it could be a privilege to sell your soul to a big company and to make money. There are a lot of people who would do a lot for a job like that, and who work like that would really change their circumstances. At the same time, there are a lot of people who are torn between taking that kind of a job, accepting that kind of position, having those priorities. It's very difficult to walk into that job and not to have your own goals and ambitions and ideas changed by some of the people around there. There's a saying I kind of like, that your environment will change you more than you will change your environment, which is a very scary thing to think about. So like I said, this challenge of the big business versus the corporate, okay, I didn't fight in World War II. I'm not scarred by it, but there is something there. I should say that when I say scarred by it, this movie also touches on ideas of PTSD. I'm not sure if that idea was really known in the same sort of scientific terms as it is now, but this movie in many ways touches on that, which is sort of cool to see. Now, as this conflict is going on, we start to learn more and more about Gregory Peck, more and more about the war. Some of these things are sort of predictable. Some of the traumas he saw, some of them are extremely unpredictable. Like, now, of course, I'm not going to say what that is. You got to watch the movie to find out. But you learn more and more that puts some stress and some tension on his character, which is interesting. In general, this movie came out in 1956, but it is pretty ahead of its time, I think. There's one scene that really struck me in this movie that's filmed outdoors. In the 50s, movies would mostly be filmed on sound stages, on sets with cameras on tripods or on big cranes. There's not going to be like handheld stuff filmed outside or anything like that, but there's one scene in particular. I don't want to spoil the movie by describing the scene too much, but I'll just say there's a prominent nocturnal exterior shot that is really vivid and really seems super ahead of its time. Now, the shot right after that is rear projection of a woman in a car, which is sort of the most quintessential 50s or 40s sort of locked off tripod, not very interesting shot. But there are some just snippets of interesting style. Another thing that's kind of interesting about this movie is that there are a number of plot lines in the film that are not mechanical. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of these sort of 50s, 40s movies are... they're just kind of mechanical, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think one of the great things about a lot of like film noir movies is how sort of the plot is sort of this like clockwork with all these little pieces fitting together. That's really sort of fun to follow all the movement and to see the logic go and all the big shifts and the way everything twists around and how everything comes to have meaning. This movie has a couple things that sort of fly really in the face of that. For instance, there are ultimatums, ultimata perhaps, I don't know, that are issued at a few times in the movie, such as, if you do this, then I'll never do that, or unless you do this, then this won't happen. And then the movie goes on, and the ultimatums are either met or not. I'm describing this really vaguely only because I don't want to spoil the movie, but the ultimatums are either met or they're not met, and the result of it isn't exactly what you would expect. It's a little bit more complicated, which is interesting. That's sort of not exactly following the classical logic in some ways, and in a way that the movie is maybe a little bit ahead of its time. There's confusion. People make ultimatums, but aren't necessarily going to act on them, and things are just going to sort of trudge on with some uncertainty. I think uncertainty, moral and otherwise, is a big part of this movie, and in general. Like I said, this is an expansive movie about life in Connecticut and Westchester County, and how empty and uncertain that can be, especially after a war, and about how trying the family dynamic in the corporate world can be. And it is a good movie in those regards. And sometimes, you people dismiss sort of the melodramatic era of the 50s as being hugely over-romantic or over-commercialized, or just hyper-national, really just sort of mainstream lame films. And there's plenty of those movies, but a lot of the times, even movies that are on that spectrum have a few tricks up their sleeve, have a few subversive undercurrents you might not be in tune with if you don't really look. And sometimes you get movies like The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit that are really pretty interesting in how they tug at the American mainstream and how they question some of the things. Now, is this some sort of radical, revolutionary movie? Of course not. But it's a pretty interesting film. That said, there are some huge anachronisms. One thing that's kind of interesting about this movie is the role of the women. The women's roles in the movie are, on the surface, not strong at all. There's a daughter, a secretary, and a wife who are not characters so much as they are a daughter, a secretary, and a wife. And what's worth is that these characters, besides being one-dimensional, they speak for the mainstream, the bad guys, right? It's the wife who is saying, hey, you need to go work for the corporate world. Now, it's not this simple. Of course, she wants to she understands Gregory Peck's ambition and his moral ideas and such, and she wants to support that. But at the same time, she is the one really who's pushing for them to be more respectable and classy and whatnot. And so not only are the characters one-dimensional, but they're speaking for the mainstream. That's really not ideal, but it's possible, if you're really generous to the movie, it's possible that is in some ways the point. And there is kind of a fine line here between a film with really one-dimensional characters and a movie that is maybe saying something about the one-dimensional, about the limitations of the roles available for women, or something along those lines, about the nature of femininity in the 50s and of domesticity and the cult of the domestic, the cult of domesticity, and such. Now, is the movie making that claim, or is this sort of a claim that we could make by watching the movie? Well, it's sort of a blurred line and such. But the point is, while initially and on the surface, certainly the women in the movie are not strong characters, and I would prefer maybe for them to be more interesting, there are things to take away from that and things to think about regarding that. Like I said, it's not exactly how I would prefer the movie to be, but there are some interesting aspects to it. So overall, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is a pretty cool movie. I think it doesn't get seen a lot these days because it is kind of long, and it is fairly mature. In a lot of ways, it doesn't really fit the bill of 50s melodrama. In a lot of ways, it's a bit ahead of its time, which is overall pretty cool. Let's turn now to this movie, The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit. You can see, maybe you can maybe you can't. It's the Walt Disney Film Classics, and it's the Kurt Russell collection. So this movie's from 1968. It's a Disney film. It's directed by Norman Tokar. I don't know who that is, but he directed a bunch of these random sort of Disney B movies, kids movies, or whatever. It stars Dean Jones. I don't really know who this is, but he's some actor. Diane Baker, don't really know who that is. It also has Fred Clark in it. Fred Clark is a fairly well-known character actor. He was actually in the movie The Solid Gold Cadillac, which I reviewed on this channel. He plays sort of the main corporate guy in that movie. Sneff, something like that was his name. It's also got Maury Amsterdam in it, who, if you may or may not be aware, but he plays Buddy in the Dick Van Dyke Show. And he's got a great sort of vaudevillian character there, and he sort of does a really watered-down version of that here. They don't really give him much to work with, and it's not really a great role, which is kind of not a great performance, so it's just sort of too bad to see. But Maury Amsterdam is kind of another very interesting character actor, and of course it's got a young, very young, I'm not sure how old, I should have looked that up, but a young Kurt Russell is in the film as well, a far cry from some of the gritty characters he would play later in his career, such as Snake or whatever in Escape from New York. This movie is mainly a movie about horse racing, which has its ups and its downs, mostly downs. Horse racing is kind of a tricky sport to show in a film. A lot of sports movies have a lot of interesting challenges to address in making a sport accessible to the people watching the movie who may or may not know anything about the sport. There's a lot of really cheesy ways to do this, mainly by really simplifying the sport and having explanations of the rules put out right front and center. And of course, this movie does this, so it simplifies horse racing too. Well, did they make the jump or did they not, basically? And the father will sort of blatantly ask, so what are the rules? How does this work? And then it will be explained to you. They go even a step further by having sort of real-time explanations in the crowd. Well, they'll have some people sitting in the crowd and they'll be like, what does that mean? Well, it was blah, blah, blah. Basically, the horse racing part ends up being lame. Horse racing, though, is also, I think, to me, just kind of a fundamentally lame idea that ties nicely into the, again, Connecticut/Westchester backdrop. This is really the only link between the horse in the gray flannel suit and the man in the gray flannel suit. I should mention, by the way, that the horse in the gray flannel suit is also adapted from a book. The book is called The Year of the Horse, though. So it was the people making the movie who thought it would be really funny to change it to the horse in the gray flannel suit. But the link is, again, this Connecticut / Westchester backdrop. Now, there's also the sort of commercial component to this, and we'll get into this. There are some interesting things here, and there are some sort of somewhat extreme sort of jokes. It's unclear if this movie is sort of so not funny that I'm not sure if we should even refer to anything as a joke, but it does have moments that are vaguely satirical. Ultimately, though, the film is completely toothless, doesn't have a subversive bone in its body, and of course it doesn't, because it's some random Disney B movie for kids that I actually paid money to have sent to my house. Well, it's for the video, I guess. So, Dean Jones, right, this is the main guy, the father, can't remember his name in the movie. Pretty poor performance in general, basically because hugely inconsistent character that's sort of not very likable and a little bit hard to understand. Also a pretty unoriginal portrayal. The character seems like a pretty clear mix of Jimmy Stewart and Jerry Lewis, which might seem like a pretty weird combination, and in a lot of ways it is. But Dean Jones, he does his best here. He works for a pharmaceutical company. This movie has a nice touch. It's pretty common in classical movies, and this movie's from 1968, but this is very much sort of a 50s movie. It's pretty common for movies from that era to reduce companies simply to the marketing agency. So someone will say, hey, I work for a chemical company, but in fact they just do, what you see them do in the movie is marketing, basically. Or I work for a construction company, but in fact what you see them do is marketing for a construction company. It's interesting that the 50s, this hyper-nationalist time with such a potent mainstream iconography and whatnot, is also so dominated by images of marketing. Interesting. In marketing, in some ways, you wonder, I wonder some way about the idea of modern influencers, tracing that back to marketing. It doesn't really map one-to-one, but there's an interesting heritage there of the sort of self-reflexive our culture catching itself in a mirror for a moment and looking at marketing, which is the tool that is continuously producing itself, basically. Anyway, whatever. The thing that is interesting about this, though, is that when you catch that glimpse of yourself in the mirror, you look kind of awkward. And in a lot of ways, this movie does have interesting moments, but they don't come out of deliberate, incisive scripting or acting or anything, that was intentional, so much as they come out of just kind of weird awkwardness that slips into the movie based on some of the ideas. So, right, what was I talking about? Pharmaceutical companies. Dean Jones works at a pharmaceutical company, and he basically works in marketing. Aspercell is what they make, some sort of, or it's the main product, some sort of pill that does something. And pharmaceutical marketing is itself pretty cursed. It's hard to know these days if we would have a main character who works for a company, a protagonist, right, working for a pharmaceutical marketing company. Maybe the pandemic has slightly turned perspectives on Pfizer or Moderna, but in general, I think the sort of dim view on both sides of the aisle of healthcare costs and things like that would sort of turn people away from pharmaceutical marketing, which also, big pharma. Like I said, both sides of the aisle, not huge fans of that. So it is kind of interesting that in this movie from 1968, Aspercell are not exactly the good guys, but the good guy, who's the main character, works there and tries to further the cause. So how is he furthering the cause? Well, like I said, he's in marketing, and Fred Clark Dugan, the boss, asks Dean Jones to come up with a campaign to bring class to Aspercell. I'm not really sure what this means. I guess I sort of, just some sort of vague marketing idea. It's hard to know if you would actually, if aspirin, for instance, would need to bring class to itself, but who knows. Dean Jones racks his mind about this. Meanwhile, his daughter is taking up riding lessons and wants more than anything her own horse. She's got a riding instructor who says that she's a great rider and all she needs is her own horse. And then she'll, the sky's the limit. And Dean Jones eventually puts two and two together, although it takes quite a while for this to happen, and realizes that the company can sponsor a horse, and then it'll get his daughter to ride the horse. And that's how they'll bring class to Aspercell. Now, obviously, this makes no sense whatsoever. If you're wanting to bring class to Aspercell, is the way to do it really to enter some random girl who doesn't know how to ride a horse into, like, local children's races? No. The Dugan, the boss, tells Dean Jones' character, hey, this is a great idea. I'm going to promote you to VP. Just register the horse in your daughter's name. Keep the company out of it. Which, again, I'm not sure if that's even, legal, given that the funds come from the company. Not sure it doesn't violate the rules. It also just doesn't make any sense. So, of course, should we expect a lot from this random Disney sort of kids movie? Probably not. I assume this is a kids movie. If this is not a kids movie, then we really got big problems here. But just to be clear, this movie is crap. And just has so many issues in terms of being a good movie, but I'm not going to harp on that too much. I guess I'll, whatever. It's extremely predictable. Characters are hard to get a grasp of. It's not funny. The plot fundamentally doesn't make any sense. But the things I'm more interested in are the awkward moments in it, sort of the interesting things that percolate up from the bottom. One of them is this idea of horses in general. This movie seems to have there's horse fetishism going on. This is using the academic use of the word fetish just to mean sort of using something for the wrong reasons or whatnot, or seeking meaning for something where that's, you aren't going to actually find anything. Commodity fetishism, for example. So why the heck is the horse so important? And when you watch the movie, the horse really is portrayed as like this fantastic object where the horse will solve all the problems, make the daughter happy, bring class to Aspercell. Now, the horse generally seems to be just an extension of Westchester County, Connecticut living. And, you could make some claims here about some sort of fake pastoral or tradition or something like that. It might be more accurate to call it a plantation tradition or something along those lines. But either way, the horse being front and center and being such an object of fantasy is pretty questionable. And this is, again, what I mean about things bubbling up. It's also maybe not just an academic use of fetishism in some ways, because there's an interesting line here where the horse instructor or whatever talks about how the daughter. I should mention Dean Jones is a single father in this movie. It's not clear why this is, other than so that he can have a romantic interest with the horse instructor, obviously. But there's no backstory about his former wife whatsoever, unless I just wasn't paying attention when they said it, which is possible. But anyway, horse instructor at one point says that the daughter has a boy problem, that she thinks of herself as being homely, and it can only be cured by horse riding, or that horse riding will give her a new sense of confidence. Which again is sort of interesting, and so there is, to some extent, some sort of sexual dimension to classy living, to owning a horse and being the talk of the town at all the fanciest Westchester ride-in things. And in a lovely turn of fate, you'll also be able to sell more Aspercell if you do all of this. So this movie, in a lot of ways, is brandishing an unholy trinity here of elitist pastimes, pharmaceutical corporate interests, and also mainstream living all kind of come together and are endorsed to some extent in this movie. Now, are they really endorsed? Well, I don't know. Like I said earlier, this movie doesn't have a subversive bone in its body. Totally toothless. And so I would say, yes, they are sort of endorsed, but there are a couple of, like I said, there are these awkward things, and you wonder sometimes if the over-the-top character that Dean Jones is playing, if the over-the-top character of Dugan is maybe it's unfair to say that there's no satire whatsoever. And there are a couple of other interesting moments. For instance, there's a sort of a mini plotline about antihistamines, which is kind of weird, where Dean Jones continuously is allergic to something in this movie. He's always sneezing, and people around him are saying, "Did you take your antihistamines?" And he goes and he takes more pills. So he is popping pills throughout the whole movie, which perhaps explains a sort of over-the-top Jerry Lewis-like outbursts or something along those lines. Who knows what those antihistamines really have in them. But this is a sort of odd moment in a lot of ways. Is this just some sort of lame joke? And I mean, there are other movies that use exactly a similar tropes. Oh, you're allergic to something. There's plenty of movies and television shows that have used exactly that plot line, plenty that came out before 1968. And so are they just pulling there? Or is there some slight undercurrent here about the ineffectiveness of the pharmaceuticals, and maybe the oafishness and the clownish nature of everything in general? Well, maybe, but overall, the movie goes pretty much all in on the horse culture. When you go to the horse competitions, the movie builds suspense through these competitions. It tries to get you invested in them, partly through all the sort of lame mechanics I talked about earlier. Another thing that's kind of conspicuous about this movie in some ways is the mentions of money. For instance, it's continuously mentioned how much the horse riding lessons cost at the beginning of the movie, and it's also conspicuously mentioned how much the horse costs a number of times. And, costs are mentioned in other movies, but I think in a lot of movies, the actual dollar amount of things are not put on show very often, partly because they might sort of alienate parts of the audience, I guess, or partly because they might not age well or something like that. It might just seem hokey. But either way, you often, this might seem like a stretch, but I think it's true, that a lot of movies don't really put like the cost front and center, unless they are sort of very specific about some mechanic. They really lay out like, hey, we're raising funds and we need this much to get here, and then you see them raise funds or something like that. But just to mention, hey, the horse costs $5,000. Hey, the riding lessons cost $900. Oh, I have to pay for these $900 riding lessons. Well, you better be getting a lot for $900. There's also a couple of sort of weird moments with the horse instructor when she says, well, I was happy once I saw that the check cleared for $900 or something like that, where it's like, why do you keep bringing this up? Why do you keep building this connection? It's almost as if the movie is gatekeeping these young kids who are watching this movie and thinking, the horse, yes, that's the way to go. The movie is reminding them that actually, finances are what matter at the end of the day. And you need money to make all these dreams come true. Now, that's one theory, but I really don't know on either of these things. The antihistamines, the continual pill popping, and all these sort of conspicuous mentions of money. I really don't know where the movie is going with either of these things. So that's The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit. It's pretty bad. In general, these movies, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit and The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit, are kind of polar opposites. I should mention one interesting thing about The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit. It has a sort of interesting title sequence, sort of reminiscent of the Pink Panther. That's just sort of vaguely interesting, has some sort of jazzy, sort of Mancini-esque, I should say, intro music as well. Oh, I should also mention Kurt Russell's character, if you're interested, is basically totally uneventful. It's some little kid. The one odd moment you get there with his characters in the beginning when he first meets Dean Jones. He's they meet at one of the first horse racing competitions, and he says, I come to these things. I don't like horses at all, but the only reason I come to these things is because my parents would only get me a sports car if I drive my sister to her horse races with it. And it's just like, man, like this is a movie we're showing to our kids, building these fantasies about horse racing and sports cars. I don't know. This movie goes all in on a certain type of mainstream life, whereas The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is the opposite. It's destabilizing that life. It's questioning these values in the face of war and in the face of some sort of moral life. Is this what you really want? And is this how a family should really be in a country should really be? So these movies, like I said, are polar opposites. And they're polar opposites not only in theme and style, but also in quality. The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit is pretty good. The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit is a bad movie that you should not watch, and that I somewhat regret having seen. But oh well, at least I've now got this permanently, so I can put it on my shelf or something. So, like I said, Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, I'd recommend checking that out, but don't bother with The Horse in the Gray Flannel Suit.